Hi all, welcome to our webinar about ending the subminimum wage. I'm going to speak a little bit slowly as people arrive. I'm Renee Morgan, the social justice strategist at Addisina Social Capital. Okay, and I wanted to, I'm going to introduce folks as they speak, but I want to just really welcome everybody here to learn and invite you to really be open and hear about a topic that you may or may not know that much about. It's really personal to me because as Saru will talk about how vast this industry is, the tipped workers and particularly the restaurant industry is over 14 million people. And about half of all people in the US have worked in a restaurant, including moi. I started working in restaurants in high school, and I worked all the way through my undergrad serving food. So I heard Saru speak on the subminimum wage probably a decade ago, and I was blown away because I eat in restaurants, I worked in restaurants, I've been around restaurants my whole life, and I actually didn't know the history, I didn't know the exploitation, I didn't really understand. And so I was really moved even then. I actually had always remembered her name. And so it's been a huge honor for this to come full circle and be able to actually work directly with Saru. So the subminimum wage, I'm gonna let actually everybody else tell you far more about it and why it's become, this was going to be vastly relevant anyway, but now it's become even more relevant politically. And I'm going to let Saru and then later on in the call, Ro Khanna speak to what's happening in Congress. This is a webinar format. We love engagement. So please ask questions in the chat feature. We will be monitoring it. And I know we have many speakers, but I hope to squeeze in as many questions as you have. And with that, I would like to say there is a little bit of comings and goings during this call. Dominique is going to leave a little bit before the end of the call, and we have Congressman Ro Khanna joining us at around quarter to the hour at the end of the call. So without further ado, I want to introduce Saru Jayaraman. Saru is the president of One Fair Wage and the director of the Food Labor Research Center at the University of California, Berkeley. She spent the last 20 years organizing, advocating for raising wages and working conditions for restaurants and other service workers. Saru is a graduate of Yale Law School and the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. She was listed in CNN's top 10 visionary women and recognized as a champion of change by the White House in 2014. She's a James Beard Foundation Leadership Award winner in 2015 and the San Francisco Chronicle Visionary of the Year in 2019. Saru has authored several books and has appeared on pretty much everywhere. MSNBC, HBO, PBS, CBS, CNN, and attended the Golden Globes in 2018 with Amy Poehler as part of the Time's Up action to address sexual harassment. So Saru, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Renee and Rachel and everybody at Addisina Capital. Very appreciative of you putting this together and pulling investors together to care about this workforce, which to me makes sense because you can't have the nation's largest workforce, this impoverished and struggling this much and think that it will be okay for the economy and for investment and for finance. These folks are a major source of consumption in our country. And here's why. As Renee said, prior to the pandemic, our industry hit almost 14 million workers. So 1 in 10 American workers worked in restaurants prior to the pandemic. And 1 in 2 Americans, as Renee said, worked in the industry at some point in their lifetime. It was the nation's number 2 largest private sector employer and number 1 fastest growing private sector employer, but always was the nation's absolute lowest paying employer, lower than farm workers, lower than other low wage workers. The absolute lowest paying employer in the United States has always been the restaurant industry. And that all of our research as to why that is, and I've written several books detailing the history as to how you have one of the largest and fastest growing industries with the lowest paying jobs, really all of that can be traced back to the money, power, and influence of a trade lobby called the National Restaurant Association. We call it the other NRA, and it truly is driven and led by the publicly traded corporations that many of you invest in or have invested in. It's largely the chains, the corporate chains that drive that National Restaurant Association, not independent small business restaurants. They will always try to say they speak for small business, but the true drivers and leaders of the National Restaurant Association are the publicly traded chains. So in doing research for my last book as to, the history of this trade lobby, how it's been so powerful, why it's managed to keep wages so low in the industry, we uncovered that in fact, the other NRA, as we call it, the National Restaurant Association, has been around since emancipation of slavery, when it first demanded the right to hire newly freed slaves, not pay them anything at all, and have them live entirely on customer tips. Now, that was a mutation of the original concept of tipping. Tipping originated in feudal Europe as an extra or bonus to the overall minimum wage. Serfs and vassals in feudal Europe got a full wage and they were given tips as like a noblesse oblige, a gift. But when the idea came to the States, it came around the time of emancipation. And at emancipation, the restaurant lobby basically mutated the idea of tipping from being an extra or bonus to becoming the wage itself. And we started with a $0 wage at emancipation and went all the way up to $2.13 an hour, which is the current absurd and ridiculous federal minimum wage for tipped workers in the United States. And that's not the wage for a tiny sliver of the population. I just told you this is the nation's second largest and number one fastest growing workforce can legally be paid a federal minimum wage of $2.13 an hour. Today, tipped workers are largely women, 70% women, disproportionately women of color. They are women who mostly work in very casual restaurants, IHOPs, Applebee's, Olive Gardens, mom and pop restaurants across the country, struggling with the highest rates of economic instability and sexual harassment of any industry because they have to tolerate inappropriate customer behavior in order to feed their families entirely in tips. There were 7 states all along that had a different system. 7 states that said, no, we want to pay a full minimum wage with tips on top. California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Minnesota, Montana, and Alaska require a full minimum wage with tips on top. And contrary to the mythology of the National Restaurant Association, these 7 states have had higher restaurant industry sales, higher small business growth, higher job growth overall in the restaurant industry, higher rates of tipping, and 1/2 the rate of sexual harassment in the industry, because when you pay a woman a full minimum wage, she isn't as reliant on the tips. She doesn't feel like she has to put up with as much from customers to feed her children. That was all prior to the pandemic. With the pandemic, 6 million restaurant workers lost their jobs. 60%, 60, were unable to access unemployment insurance because in most states, the 43 states with a sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, in most states they were told your wages are too low to meet the minimum threshold to qualify for benefits. And this was even worse for women of color who tended to work in more casual restaurants, Red Lobsters, IHOPs, Denny's, as opposed to fine dining, where there were cash tips. Cash tips largely went unrecorded, unreported, not just by workers, but also by employers. And so when workers went to apply, they were told, you do not qualify. You made too little. You don't meet the minimum threshold. So millions of workers were compelled to go back to work before they felt safe, before it was safe, and work in very dangerous conditions. The CDC in September named restaurants as the #1 super spreader location among customer-facing businesses. They said adults are twice as likely to get COVID eating in a restaurant. So workers were asked to go back to work and serve as public health marshals, enforcing social distancing and mask rules on the very same customers from whom they were supposed to get tips to make up their base wage. An impossible situation. 90% of workers reported tips went down 50 to 75%, and that they were unable to enforce these rules because they had to get tips from the fewer customers that were walking in the door. But worst of all, 40% of workers reported that sexual harassment went way up during the pandemic. And hundreds of women submitted comments saying, male customers are asking me to take off my mask so they can judge my looks and therefore my tips on that basis. We heard this so frequently across the country that we actually coined a term, masculine harassment, because we were hearing it so frequently from so many women, which meant these workers went from being, from suffering from an economic, racial, gender injustice to now this subminimum wage for them becoming a matter of life and death. They became the only essential workers to not be paid a minimum wage and the only essential workers to be asked to remove their protective gear for a chance to earn their income. So this is a COVID emergency, and we're so grateful that President Biden recognized it as such after workers rising up and organizing and striking and demanding this change. President Biden heard and made $15 minimum wage and full elimination of the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers part of his overall $2 trillion COVID relief package that is moving very quickly through Congress. This week, on Tuesday, the Senate introduced the bill. Senator Sanders introduced the bill in the Senate. It now has 38 Democratic co-sponsors, meaning there's only 12 Democrats. And Senator Sanders, who leads the Budget Committee, believes they can do it through what they call budget reconciliation. They only need 51 votes, which means it comes down to 12 Democrats and whether they will agree to it. In the House, we already have more than 190 co-sponsors on the bill, which means it will pass. So the question is, A, are there companies who can get ahead of this fast-moving train, this ending of a legacy of slavery that is likely to happen in a few months, and do the right thing and perhaps see a boost in their shares if they do the right thing by their workers and end this legacy of slavery? Or even if it doesn't happen in Congress, are there publicly traded companies that can understand that this is the way the wind is blowing, that it's time to end this legacy of slavery, and that people have finally come to realize that women should never have had to rely on tips for their base wage to begin with? That's the question on the table. We are very close to making history in Congress. Whether it happens or not, there's a real potential for publicly traded companies to really get ahead, do the right thing, distinguish themselves, and find success both from treating their workers well and from the consequent goodwill they get from consumers as a result. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Saru. And just so you all know, and we're going to move on to hear exactly from an essential worker, but right now there are no publicly traded restaurants that do not pay a sub-minimum wage. Every single publicly traded restaurant pays the sub-minimum wage. So it's pertinent. I'd like to turn it over to Dominique. So everything, Saru just gave you the background and overview of how we got here, but this is real life people that are impacted by what's happening. And so Dominique Brown is here. She was born and raised in our nation's capital. And after going to college in West Virginia, she came back to DC. She started working in restaurants as a hostess and worked her way up to becoming a server and eventually trained as a bartender. She worked in some of the top restaurants in DC and is currently working as a concierge. So welcome, Dominique.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm wondering if you can just share a bit about your experience.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, giving me this chance to speak on the issue. I work in the hospitality industry as a way to show my love language, which is acts of service. I love taking care of people, having people over, feeding them. So working in the restaurant was, I think, was a good balance to help me express that energy. And when I take care of people, like learn from them, they learn from me, we share stories, come together in a common space. A lot of times when I'm working, I act sometimes as a therapist. I help celebrate big moments for people when they come in and dine. So it's really a fulfilling job when we are taking seriously and not taken for granted. A lot of times we feel like when we tell people what we do as for work, people are like, oh, get a real job if you want to get paid. And I'm like, I do a real job. Who would take care of you and your family if I wasn't here to do that and help to make these moments special for everyone? And, you know, from making sure allergies are put in correctly, which is a very serious thing, to just making sure every detail when you have events in our spaces goes well. I take pride in my work, and to think that this industry is the only industry where we expect for the consumers or the guests who come in and visit to pay us. It should be on the employers to pay their workers a livable wage across the board. Because when it's the guests paying us tips, which they aren't lawfully obliged to do, they do it because they want to extend a courtesy or because it's a social norm at this point. People's biases come into play, and that's where the legacy of slavery and everything else plays into it. Especially me as a Black woman, I can't help if someone they feel a certain type of way towards me, and that's reflected in the tips. From not for me not doing my job well or giving an attitude or anything, it's just purely out of my control. And then from the managers who put certain people on the better nights where you make the most money, they have their biases and they have their friends, and they make sure their friends, which a lot of times happen to be white men, get the better nights and the better shifts, so they make more money than me from those instances. So it's all these different factors, and I think it's a full circle thing where this work that we're talking about now, making sure that everyone is paid a sub-minimum wage, is racial justice, so that people who look like me and other people of color, Black and brown, who are in the front and the back of house, are paid on a base level the same thing. And the tips are just extra. We're not depending on, you know, whatever this customer's whim is at the time, because they can be having a bad day or they don't particularly like how you look. And then me having to be nice and not stand up for myself when people are harassing me. I had a customer, older white gentleman, want to touch my hair while I'm serving him. And I'm like, no, you know, trying to be nice and just walk away. But if I was paid a base wage, I can say, no, sir, that's inappropriate. I need you to stop that. And if you don't stop that, I will ask a manager to come over here and have you leave. Because it's harassment. No, like, why would you think that it's okay to touch a stranger? You know?
Yeah, I appreciate, I mean, that example is so profound, because in no other workplace would that happen, right? Like, because no other customer or no other coworker your salary is not dependent on that. And usually there's an HR department. And I mean, with systemic racism, it's difficult to know how that would play out in other situations, but your wage itself would not be dependent on that. Yeah, I really appreciate that. Can you speak to like your experiences during COVID, or what you're hearing on the street with your colleagues?
Right. So after the initial shutdown, I chose not to go back to work because I didn't feel safe with this affecting mostly the people of color in a higher rate. So some friends went back to work, and they've told me they've had to do more with like manual labor, like lifting heavy furniture and moving it outside, because you can only dine outdoors, and dealing with the different weather patterns that are happening. You have no control over the weather. And then also having all of these scares from, oh, you've come into contact with someone who's tested positive, you should go get tested constantly after going back to work. So you're just put at risk at such a higher rate right now, which is why I'm like, I can't do it. I will not put myself in harm's way. And I was able to do that because I was successfully able to get my unemployment. There are a lot of people whose unemployment is just not enough. And there are a lot of people who are still struggling to get their unemployment, waiting for back pay. And it's just ridiculous how much our industry, the people who are asked to go back to work or forced to go back to work, they're not valued at all. We're not seen as essential, even though people are calling us essential workers, but it doesn't feel like we're really essential or that we matter when we can't pay for healthcare and pay for groceries or basic needs to provide for our family, but we're called to go back to work and we're taken for granted. We feel subhuman.
Yeah, it really strikes me, this idea of essential workers at the same time that the national conversation around racial equity is happening in a bigger way since the murder of George Floyd. We're having this national, what does racial equity mean? What does racial justice mean? And even in the business community, I know this call is there are many investors on the call, like, how do we create racial equity in our firms? How do you do that in a capitalist system? And to me, it just seems so clear hearing you speak that like you said, racial justice and racial equity would, an obvious place to start would be get rid of the subminimum wage, to have equal pay for equal work, and have an equitable system for everybody, not regardless of race and gender. Yeah, thank you so much for being here and sharing your experience. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. And also, another reason why I didn't go back is I didn't feel comfortable with the workplace where I was. It was in the midst of the protests in New York City, for Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor movement, where my restaurant was saying, come back to work, come back to work. And me being one of the only Black women that works for them, but they were also insistent on, oh, we're going to call the police on people who are asking for money outside of the restaurant. So I felt unsafe personally as a Black woman. So that added on top of the unsafe protocols around COVID, but also me as a Black woman feeling not safe in the workplace because of the threat of calling police. And we never know how those situations can play out. So just being conscious of when you have people of color and Black people in your space, of how you choose to go about things and what protocols you put in place.
Yeah, I mean, you're being asked to risk your life in so many ways, with COVID and the police during a racially charged era. It's just, yeah, I hear you. So next I'd like to introduce Rachel Robichodi, one of my favorite people and boss. Rachel is the founder and CEO of Adesina Social Capital, and we are a firm dedicated to transforming wealth into a tool that supports the well-being of people and the planet. Among her many recognitions, she was named one of Financial Advisor magazine's 10 young advisors to watch. She's also the founding member of the Women's Wealth Initiative, a nationwide group of female wealth managers. She's especially proud of serving as a role model and creating pathways for more women and people of color in finance. She also is somebody you see regularly in the media, including the New York Times, Bloomberg, CNBC, Forbes, Financial Planning Magazine. She's also just an amazing human being. So with that, Rachel, can you give us an update about what this campaign is all about here?
Absolutely. So I feel like I just want to speak directly. We have many investors on the call. We were just kind of quickly doing a napkin calculation and realizing that there are multiple billions of dollars represented in this webinar. And so it's my job now to give you the tools that you need to actually do something about this. I think that the folks who are directly impacted have already started to really make the very clear case about how this is an issue at the intersection of racial, gender, and economic justice. And so what I want to offer to you as the investors is the tools that you're going to need. So when it's time to file corporate resolutions. This is definitely an issue that we'll want to be looking at if this is something that we're still contending with and hasn't been dealt with on the lobbying front, or the legislative front rather. So what we have for you is an investor statement that's in support of ending the subminimum wage. Over $500 billion of us already signed on, over 70 different investment firms, and it makes the business case with all of the attendance statistics for ending the subminimum wage. And it emphasizes a lot of these harms and really makes that kind of statistical case. So just to give you an example, if you go to the next slide, when we say that it upholds systemic racism, just to be really clear, in the investor statement, we showed that 41% of all tipped workers are people of color. And despite those folks being overrepresented in tipped front of the house positions, Black tipped workers receive less in tips than their white counterparts, with Black women only earning 60% of what white men earn who work in the same positions. Now, for those of us who are investors, we know that that's a material risk to a company, because many companies have anti-discrimination as part of the policies in their companies. And anything that disadvantages women, and particularly people of color, is actually not in the best interest of that particular business. Inside the investor statement, you'll also see the statistics related to the increase in sexual harassment and the risk to essential workers in the time of COVID. But what's really surprising about our investor statement is the economic benefits. And what we're seeing is these are actually the places where the particularly restaurants, but also the other employers that are allowed and take advantage of paying subminimum wages, when they change that, they experience higher profits, higher employment, higher overall company growth, and they have a lower poverty rate for their human resources, which are their most important asset. And in an age where most investors or most consumers, or over 60% of consumers, are saying that they would boycott a brand based on racial justice alone, for our companies and our portfolios to be aware of this issue and actually be acting on it is something that's just a matter of inspiring brand loyalty, pure and simple. So we've had this investor statement out for a while. I want to refer you to our website to take a look at it. We've already had other lobbyists and other people in the movement working with the statistics that we put together in this investor statement. If you can go to the next slide. Today, we're also releasing our exclusion list. So rather than just saying you should go out and figure out who these companies are kind of all on your own, what we're actually doing is releasing and sharing our intellectual property, and letting you know that there's a free, independent, and public data source for where you can find the list of publicly traded companies that continue to pay a subminimum wage. And Renee is also leading the way on coordinating shareholder engagement. So if this is something that you want to be more involved in on the proxy voting or the corporate resolution filing side of things, please reach out to Renee for that. And if I guess the thing that I would say here is that not only is this an issue of justice, this is actually a deeply financial issue as well. We have an interest in building sustainable portfolios for the long term, and ending the subminimum wage has these tremendous benefits for companies, and it reduces these risks. So if there's anything that the last couple of years have taught us, it's that ultimately, if we want a different world than the one that we're already living through, that it's time for those of us who have access to assets and power to place those in service of justice. And by the way, in the process, we're doing what's best for our portfolios as well. So I'm very happy to share these particular resources with all of you so that we can act in a coordinated way around this issue of racial, gender, and economic justice.
Thanks so much, Rachel. I put the link in the chat so folks can link on that. And please enter any questions in the chat or the Q&A. And Francis Sherman, I have your questions here, which is going to lead me into the next speaker. So first I want to introduce Chef Cliff Rome. I'm thrilled to have him here. Chef Rome founded Rome's Joy Companies, which include 2 restaurants, a full service catering, an event planning company, basically if you're eating food in Chicago, you're eating from Chef Rome's conglomeration. With more than 25 years of experience in the field of food service, Chef Rome has received numerous awards and recognition from local, national, and international media. He's made frequent television appearances as well as features in the Chicago Sun-Times, Washington Post, Black Enterprise Magazine. Chef Rome is committed to promoting African-American participation in the culinary industry. He's partnered with Careers Through Culinary Arts Program, After School Matters, Washburn Culinary School, Healthy School Campaign, YMCA, Center for New Horizon, Education for Careers, Chicago Cook Workforce Partnership. And he's been actively involved in training people seeking opportunities to expand their skill set within the service and hospitality industry. In fact, we were talking right before, he's training about 100 people a year in the industry. So welcome, Chef Rome.
Thank you.
Yeah, and the question that always comes up when we're talking about this, and it came up in the chat, is that, aren't you going to lose money, right? Like, isn't this, like, what is the business case for paying a living wage, for not paying the sub-minimum wage? And so the question is basically, what is the financial impact on restaurants? And I'd love you to share your experience of not paying a sub-minimum wage.
Well, so I'm gonna start with a little story. I grew up in Chicago, south side of Chicago, fortunate enough to be in a household with my grandmother and Mama T, usually known as Big Mama, right? It was my great grandmother. So my moral compass has always been tight, right? And so for me, when we start thinking about business, and I started thinking about our business, because it was a story of a young lady who was working for us. Our restaurant opens, because we're breakfast, so we open up pretty early, 7 a.m. in the city, which means you probably have to get there between 5:30 and 6 a.m. So this one young lady worked for us, used to get there all the time, on time, and all of a sudden she got there a little bit later. And I said, well, what's the problem? Because this is a perfect person to come to work and do any and everything that you want. And she was the opening server, by the way. And so one day I sat her down and I said, what's happening? I can't believe that you have been a model employee. And she started crying. I said, well, what happened? She said, Chef, it just takes me so long to get here in the morning. And I said, well, I didn't know that. Well, so what happened? So she takes 2 buses, then a train, then she drops off her child, then she gets back on the bus, and then she walks, and she's still there at 6:30. I couldn't believe it. And the very first thing we said is, how much does she get paid? She cannot be making less than minimum wage, and she definitely can't be making minimum wage. She should be making more, because she is the forward-facing individual that we have in our company. So she is a direct brand of what we are and what we believe in. To fast forward, I tell people restaurants are tough. It's hot, it's sharp, it's loud, and it's wet. So the biggest part of that is that it's long hours and it's low wages, right? And so if you work in this industry, you gotta love it. You're not coming in here just because you want to show up. You have to really want to serve people. And so we understood that. And just by reaching back from my rearing from my great grandmother, you treat people fair. And the way that we started off is just thinking about, we have to pay everybody the same money. Because what's going to happen is we're going to get the best out of that particular individual. And so for us, it's always been about fostering a more equitable and healthy work environment. And because of that, focus on the front of the house worker, what happens more times than not, you're going to get a better result. We've afforded folks a long enough runway to fail, which means that they're going to make some mistakes along the way. But I can't judge them and hold back resources or just revenue and expect to get the best out of them. So for us, it's been a major impact on making sure that first they're taken care of financially, because we know that that is just a trickle down effect. If they can't take care of themselves, they can't take care of their family, which means that you're not going to get the best out of the employee. So it is imperative that when we start to talk about equality and treating people fair, that we have an honest conversation around what's fair. And paying someone something so that they can take care of themselves is an honest way of living. And so that's kind of that's how I wanted to start, and just hopefully I answered your question in that.
And so I guess just to follow up on the question in the chat, but also it is the question that comes up most often with investors and business type people is, does it impact your business? Is there a financial impact within your restaurants? Or is it positive because you get, like, as you said, the people, you're getting people at their best?
Yeah, I think that absolutely it'll be a change in our catering operation. When we first started our catering operation, we automatically started at the same rate. So we never saw anything different. So we were always at or above minimum wage. In our restaurants, generally the dynamic is where the server or front of the house is making a smaller wage than the back of the house. But we soon realized if we wanted the same impact as our catering operation, we have to bring those wages up. And so I think that it's a shift, but it's a healthy pivot for restaurants to understand if you expect to make it to the other side, the only way that you're going to do it is the forward facing individuals that we're not paying at a certain rate. So yeah, the initial shock of saying, okay, well, they're at this rate and now we have to bring it up is a discussion that you have to have simply because it's fair and it's necessary.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So Ru, I'm wondering if you can jump in because I know you have some information about what's gone on in California with this specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Renee. Thank you, Dominique and Cliff, for sharing your own personal experiences, and as always, Rachel, for leading this. I did just want to make sure everybody understood that the idea that these publicly traded companies would somehow go bust or lose profits if they paid everybody a full minimum wage with tips on top is just completely obliterated by the fact that they all pay $15 with tips on top in California, and the full minimum wage, California and Washington state, and the full minimum wage with tips on top in 7 states: California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Minnesota, Montana, and Alaska. And all of these publicly traded, because it's the law in those 7 states, not because they have to, but they, to comply with the law, have to pay the full minimum wage with tips on top. All of the chains are growing faster in California than in any other state in the United States. They're growing faster in California than any of the other 43 states with a sub-minimum wage. And that is for a couple of reasons. First, we have done extensive research with Cornell University's School of Hospitality Management and in School of Industrial and Labor Relations, and we calculated turnover expenses for these large restaurants. The restaurant industry has the highest rates of employee turnover of any industry in the US. Not surprising when you know we have the lowest wages. There's a 300% turnover rate, 3 turns typically in one position in 1 year. That costs about $11,000 per year in retraining, rehiring, morale, recruitment. For a small restaurant, it costs the chains millions of dollars in unaccounted for costs. And all of that we calculated through this huge study with Cornell, you can cut in half by paying people a full minimum wage with tips on top because turnover goes way down. So in California, turnover goes way down. But the other reason why it works in California, of course, the economy is better because people are paid better, they spend in restaurants. But the other reason it works in California is that we got a law passed in Congress that says tips are the property of workers, all workers. But if you pay people the full minimum wage, everybody, kitchen staff, dining staff, tips can be shared among all non-management workers in the restaurant, kitchen staff and dining staff. And that has created more equity between front and back. It has created more unity between kitchen staff and dining staff. And it's also allowed a lot of these companies to thrive because they are able to find excellent, as Cliff was saying, both front of house staff and back of house staff. And there was a tremendous shortage of kitchen staff before the pandemic. So all of these reasons have really been the undergirding reasons why the industry is doing so much better, and including these publicly traded companies are doing so much better in states where they pay a full minimum wage with tips on top.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that, and Cliff, you may be able to speak to this, and I also know Saru, you can as well. But like in your, because you're a privately held, you're a private company. Do you have like other colleagues, and is there a group of you all that are paying the higher wages than the publicly traded companies? And what is your retention, your experience with that?
I think that there's So there was a idea that there was just a shortage of talent. And what you realize is that you're not putting enough out there in order to attract the talent. And so we decided, myself and most of my contemporaries who are in the industry, let's pay them above that, right? So that let's take that off the table. Let's take money off the table. We know that we're going to pay for the talent that we want. And then let's start training from that standpoint. And to that, retention has dropped down. And people leave because of the industry for various reasons. But let the money be the last thing that you start to talk about in terms of why they left. And more times than not, it's been a success story. So they left from one place to another place, and it was not necessarily a lateral move.
Yeah, and Cliff is one of 800 restaurant companies around the country, all of them independent, so not a single one publicly traded. 800 restaurant companies that support either already pay, like Cliff, a full minimum wage with tips on top, or support what we call one fair wage, a full minimum wage with tips on top. So there are, during the pandemic, we heard from hundreds and hundreds of independent restaurant owners that actually they thought this was the time for change. That in many cases, a lot of them were surprised to see that their sub-minimum wage workers couldn't get unemployment insurance. Many were moved by the murder of George Floyd to want to move away from a legacy of slavery. And to be honest with you, a lot of companies couldn't get their workers to come back to work during the pandemic unless they paid a full minimum wage. And so we saw a lot of change happening, a lot of change among independent restaurants, zero change among publicly traded companies. So I think there's an opportunity. The independent restaurants are taking the lead here. There's an opportunity for at least one of these companies to stand out and do the right thing. And if it's okay, hi, Congressmember.
Hi, how are you?
Thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Maybe
Yeah.
I'll follow up with the call to action after you speak.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, I was gonna shift, and that was actually where I was gonna shift to anyway. Hi, Congressperson Ro Khanna. There you are. Things are moving on my screen here. I'm Renee Morgan. Thank you so much for joining us. Let me do a brief introduction, and I'd love to just turn it over to you and hear what's going on in Congress with this. But for everyone else, Congressman Ro Khanna represents the California 17th Congressional District. It's located in the heart of the Silicon Valley, and he's serving his second term. Rep. Khanna sits on the House Budget Committee, the Armed Service Committee, and the Oversight and Reform Committees, and is vice chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and also serves as the assistant whip for the Democratic Caucus. So I'm super thrilled to have you here. Thank you so much. And I believe you know we're speaking about ending the sub-minimum wage. And for the first time, I think ever, there's a real potential of this happening on the federal level. So I'd love to get your take on that and, you know, how it's going there.
I appreciate it. And I'm so honored to be on. Thank you for what everyone's doing. A special thank you to Saru. It doesn't surprise me, having seen her in law school and her activism back then, to see her standing up for the underprivileged, the working class. To me, this is a justice issue. And the way I approach it is workers are not getting paid for the productivity that they're producing. This is not an act of charity. This is not an act of compassion. In this country, even under the free market, you believe that when you're producing things, when you're adding productivity, you ought to be compensated for what you're producing. And what's happened is that the income that workers are producing is getting taken from them and going redistributed upwards to executives and the investor class. And so we need at minimum a $15 minimum wage, and we need to make sure that that increase includes workers who are in hospitality, workers who are doing cleaning, workers who are in the restaurant industry, workers who have been excluded in part because they get a suboptimal salary, and then there's this expectation that somehow gratuity is going to make up for it, which it never does. And by the way, this has been compounded in the gig economy, where you have so many of the DoorDash delivery workers or Instacart workers making hugely below minimum wage, which is already atrocious. I mean, minimum wage is at $7.25, and you aren't even making that. And then they have all these costs, what they're having to pay for gas, for their own vehicle maintenance, some people paying for cleaning supplies. So you have this really oppressive condition. And for the first time, we're saying $15 wage, and that wage should be for everyone. And that will have such a dramatic effect because it's going to raise wages up and down the ladder. It's going to have people spend that money, which is going to be stimulant for the economy. And it's finally going to have people be paid for the work they're doing. We know how valuable this work is because, as I tell everyone, when we're in a crisis with a pandemic and people said, what are essential workers? Who are the people who we really need? They didn't think members of Congress. I mean, they said members of Congress do your job. That was about it. They didn't think lawyers. They didn't think bankers. They didn't think startup founders. They thought about the basic needs. You know, who's going to get us our groceries? Who's going to deliver our food if we're afraid to go out? Who's going to get us our packages for our kids so our kids have clothes? Who's going to make sure that our trash is still picked up? Who's going to make sure that basic shelves are still stocked? We understood who actually is adding real value in our society, value with things which we would be unable to live without. And so if it's so starkly clear that that the individuals or essential workers are adding value, they ought to be paid a fair wage and a $15 wage. We're going to pass it through the House. We ought to pass it through the Senate, the Raise the Wage Act, and we ought to do it through reconciliation with 51 votes if that's what it will take.
If I might ask a question, Congress member, I'm Rachel Rivas. Thank you so
Hi,
much
Rachel.
for being here. Hi. What impact does it have to have $500 billion of investors making the statement? How does that, like, what impact does it have to see an investor movement alongside what's happening legislatively?
That's huge. I mean, I really salute you, the 538 billion who've decided to disinvest from public companies that pay a sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. I think that is an extraordinary message, and it's a message that I think will have an impact. When Senator Dan Sanders and I had just introduced a bill called the Stop Bezos Act and said pay $15 or you're going to be on the hook for all the public expenditures of employees within 3 weeks. Bezos raised to $15. So these kind of public campaigns, especially that 538 billion is huge, can have an impact. But it should not excuse Congress. I mean, I think what we need is Congress to pass the Raise the Wage Act, and that will complement the efforts. But I want to just thank the investors. I know that they're based in San Francisco. I'm proud of my Bay Area. And I know that they're also speaking here, I'm told. So I just want to thank them for their vision and courage in doing this.
Thank you so much, and thanks for joining us. I don't know if you have, I know you only had a few minutes, but I guess I did want to say, like, does it look like this is going to happen? You all are going to, you have the votes to pass it?
Well, I think one of the things is that we've got to be on guard, candidly, for dilution and carve-outs to this Raise the Wage Act. I mean, I think the Raise the Wage Act will happen. The question is, they're always the tipped workers are always the ones who sometimes get sacrificed, or the wage is lessened for tipped workers. So we need to make sure we be on guard for those who are going to try to dilute the final bill. I have co-sponsored the original bill, as have others, and I will make sure we're advocating to make sure there's no dilution of it. But it comes down to the Senate. And, you know, I've said again and again that the filibuster is a relic of Jim Crow. It was Calhoun, a Southern state senator who wanted to protect slave state interests. Reconciliation, the Byrd Rule, which keeps these things out on minimum wage, that is a relic of 1985 anti-deficit policies by, again, someone who was a segregationist, Robert Byrd. So we can't be governed in 2020 by those procedural checks on the ability to get things done. And I think we're going to need a real campaign in the Senate to get this across the finish line.
Thank you so much. That actually brings us to the next slide. Is Saru, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you so much, Congressman.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah,
thank
thank you
so
for
much.
joining
together.
Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Would it be possible to go back to the slide with the senators that have not yet signed on? There are 12 Democratic senators that have not yet signed on, and we are not a partisan organization. This is not a partisan issue at all. I hope people saw what happened in Florida, which is a very red state and voted for Trump. 64% of Floridians voted to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour and to raise the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers to nearly that, 13 something in Florida. So this is an overwhelmingly popular issue among both Democratic and Republican voters. The problem is not the voters. The problem is not the bipartisan nature of the issue. The problem is the power of the Restaurant Association over Republicans and their refusal to bring this issue even to a vote under Mitch McConnell, and their refusal to vote to raise the minimum wage in any way. Many of them don't even believe there should be a minimum wage, actually. And some say it's unconstitutional. So we are focused, therefore, on the 12 Democratic senators who have said they support raising the minimum wage and are saying they support the president's agenda, but have not yet endorsed it. As Congressmember Khanna said, through budget reconciliation, it would just take these 12 to agree for this to be over. And so because of that, we're focused on these senators from Delaware, Nevada, New Hampshire, Colorado, Arizona, Maine, West Virginia, New Jersey, New Hampshire, and Montana to really get us across the finish line. And if you go to the next slide, you can just go to our website, onefairwage.org/take action to put your name and your zip code, and it will automatically send a letter to your senators and House members asking them to pass the Raise the Wage Act in its entirety. As Congressmember Khanna said, no carve-outs, no lesser wage for tipped workers. We can do this, but I think I want to say I so appreciate this audience because, you know, when the Fight for 15 started for fast food workers and for retail workers, many companies saw the way the wind was blowing and got ahead of it. Amazon, for whatever other things we think about Amazon, and Target and many others went to 15 because they saw it was not just the right thing to do, not just the way the wind was blowing, but good for their business. In fact, Amazon is currently paying for ads supporting the Raise the Wage Act, promoting themselves as a major endorser of the $15 minimum wage. If non-tipped corporations can do this, then we can get at least one publicly traded restaurant corporation to get ahead the way Target and Amazon and other companies did, get ahead of the way the wind is blowing, and get some good publicity for themselves by supporting a full minimum wage for tipped workers with tips on top.
Yeah, and as we know in the investor world, usually if you can get one in the industry, especially a big name, everybody else tends to follow. So we're encouraged, you know, obviously this is a call to action call. This is not just sit back and listen. So we're definitely asking you to like get involved with the political piece and call your senators, especially if you live in those states. And then also the exclusion list, which I want to circle back to. But I do want to hit a couple questions that people have asked. And Saru, you may, I actually know the answer, but I'm going to turn it over to you because people would rather hear you speak. What other sectors are covered by the subminimum wage besides restaurants?
Yes, so there's several other tipped workers. Almost none are publicly traded company sectors, but nail salons, car wash workers, parking attendants, airport wheelchair attendants, so the folks who push your wheelchair in the airports, massage therapists, and some sex workers are sub-minimum wage tipped workers. And that's just tipped workers. The Raise the Wage Act also includes a full minimum wage for workers with disabilities. So that this really could end up including a total of hundreds of millions of workers in its, you know, in terms of how many workers would get uplifted and get a raise.
Great. The other question, go ahead, Rachel.
Yeah, I think there's a really great question about unionization and the role of unions and other worker organizations in the campaign. I know that there's a lot that's been happening on this front. Can you just speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, there are all of the major unions are working together with us to pass this bill, the Raise the Wage Act, $15 and full elimination of the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. SEIU, which by the way has tipped workers in its membership. SEIU represents a lot of airport workers, so they have those wheelchair attendants in their membership who would get a raise to 15 and currently earn $2.13 an hour in much of the country. So SEIU, the AFL-CIO, UFCW, there are a number of unions and hundreds of worker organizations all over the country, and particularly in those 12 states, that are part of this very large coalition trying to move this bill to happen. I think the key part that Congressmember Khanna lifted up that is important to note is that the coalition is going to fight for 15. It's incumbent on some of us to make sure we don't let anybody be excluded from that 15. So those of us that represent tipped workers in particular have to make sure it's not just 15, it's full elimination of the subminimum wage for tipped workers. And to the question about why some of these Democratic folks haven't signed on, it's honestly a very good question, being Democrats, why they have not signed on. Some of them are pushing for regionalism, a lesser wage in some parts of the country than others, which we know exacerbates racial inequity. So if there's regionalism, that would mean typically the South would get a lesser wage, meaning a lot of Black people, Black and brown people, would get a lesser wage than people in New York and Washington and other white parts of the country, so whiter parts of the country. So it's critical that we fight against any kind of regionalism. But some of these moderate Democrats are also pushing for carve-outs like a lesser wage for tipped workers or to cut workers with disabilities. So that is why there's a holdout right now. And we are having to push these moderate to conservative senators to understand we just need to pass the bill in its entirety. And we're also counting on Schumer to help us round up those folks.
Thank you so much, Saru. I want to thank all the panelists. I mean, Cliff, thank you so much for joining and telling us what's going on in Chicago and within your business. And Saru, always for just continuing your passionate fight for equal pay. Dominique had to leave the call a little bit early, but I just really appreciate that. Dominique was able to join us. And one of the things that we really value here in Addisina, and one of the things that, you know, we continue to hope to do is bridge this gap. Bridge the gap between investors and actually what's happening on the streets with social justice movements and the communities that are most impacted by the decisions that get made in boardrooms. So I really appreciate her being here, and Rachel always for representing the, you know, steering the ship or whatever analogy you want to use for leading us at Addisina.
And thank you, Renee, for encouraging all of us with this campaign to not only be engaged as investors, but as whole human beings. We are citizens, we are investors, we are consumers. Use this information. Go out, amplify this issue, contact your representatives to make sure that we move to what is economically best for all of us and also in the interest of justice. So thank you all for being here today.
Yeah, in our exclusion, so the calls to action, as you know, we've said a bunch with the senators, and then our exclusion list, you know, we use that as a divestment strategy within Addisina, but you can use that as a consumer. Don't go to those, write letters to those companies, use your power as a consumer. And also with any type of shareholder advocacy, I'm always here to speak to those on the call that are doing that work within the community. So I appreciate everybody, and let's, you know, get a fair wage for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much.